Hello again, friends, and thank you for joining me in this workshop in which we're going to be discussing creating aphrodisia rituals. Let's talk a little bit about what an aphrodisia ritual even is. So, technically, an aphrodisia is any ritual at all that celebrates Aphrodite's mysteries. So there were several different aphrodisia festivals documented throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. They were usually bathing rituals, which were symbolic of her rebirth. But they took on some different forms. They did not look exactly the same. These city-states throughout ancient Greece, there was not a unified Greece, right? Not at that time. So the culture was really different from one city-state to the next. And the rituals then were necessarily very different from each other. The rituals usually acknowledge the birth of Aphrodite coming from the sea foam. So according to Hesiod's Theogony, which is the version of Aphrodite's birth that I most resonate with, and that I see as sort of being the larger picture version of her birth, is that Aphrodite was the child of Ouranos, the Titan of the sky, who was castrated by his son Kronos. And his castrated testicles fell into the ocean where they frothed and foamed. And from that foam, Aphrodite was born. And she sort of rises up from the waves and is carried by the wind and the waves past Kythera, past some other locations to where she finally lands, sets foot on land in Cyprus, at a place called Paphos. And so we see her referred to as the Cytherean goddess because she came so close to Kythera. We see her called the Cyprian goddess, or the Cyprian or Cypriot goddess, because she eventually came to land on Cyprus. And we also see her referred to as Paphia, which is she of Paphos. So this watery, oceanic birth of Aphrodite, child of the sky and the sea. And she has both qualities. She is a goddess of the sky, and of aerial and ethereal things. And she's also the goddess of watery, emotional, sort of that deep psychological, emotional things. Very, very few details of the ancient rites were documented. So there were lots of known cities and regions that celebrated an aphrodisia, but there's very, very little information about what those aphrodisia rituals involved or looked like. And there are some reasons for that, right? I mean, these are mystery rituals, so we don't speak of the mysteries. So that's why there's not very much that was documented. Part of why there was not very much that was documented. So in Athens, we do have some information about the aphrodisia that was celebrated in ancient Athens. It was celebrated as a bathing ritual. It happened on the fourth day following the first new moon after the summer solstice. So that would be in late July or late June or early July. If you're curious, in 2024, that date, the fourth day following the first new moon after the summer solstice, will be on July 8th. So if you're wanting to celebrate the aphrodisia according to Athenian tradition and timing, that's your day for it in 2024. And it would have been one of the very first holidays of the new year for Athens, this rebirth, this birth of everything, because Aphrodite is very much associated with the springing forth of new life. And this there are also references to this particular Aphrodisia being celebrated with very lavish symposia. And a symposium is a drinking party that happens among men, but there would be courtesans that were heavily featured during these drinking parties. They were the ones who were providing the music and the entertainment and the conversation and the sort of titillating experiences, those inviting experiences. And so very often there would be sort of the public ritual that happened with the Aphrodisia, and then it would continue to be celebrated into the night by these drinking parties with some of Aphrodite's women. In Cyprus, we also have evidence of the Aphrodisia happening there. And of course, I mentioned that according to Hesiod's Theogony, Cyprus is where she was actually born. And so Cyprus has a very long-standing history. Cyprus is the place where the oldest known temple to Aphrodite as Aphrodite stood. That was the place in Greece where her worship took root. So it was also celebrated as a bathing ritual. And we have a little bit more detail about this particular one. So icons of Aphrodite and her daughter Peitho, whose name means persuasion. And we see that name Peitho in things like sympathy and other words like that, were taken to Old Paphos from New Paphos. So by the time this ritual got documented, people weren't living in the ancient city of Paphos. They called that Old Paphos, but they had a new city that had been named Paphos. And so they would take the icons that were installed in the temple there and carry them down to Old Paphos, which was closer to the waters, so that those statues could be bathed and washed in the waters of Aphrodite's birthplace, the place where she first came onto land. And then everybody was instructed in the mysteries of Aphrodite, and that is all the information we're given about it. They were instructed in the mysteries of Aphrodite, which I think is so fascinating. And there's so much opportunity to play there in sort of investigating what those mysteries of Aphrodite are. Sorry, my brain's just kicking off. Was it a puppet show? Were people acting out, which is very possible that was what was happening, is that, that they were characters that were playing out mysteries of Aphrodite, or that they were maybe given sex tips. Who knows? And then the participants were then, after these mysteries were shared, they were each given a measure of salt and a phallus cake. So that's what we know of what this ritual looked like. But obviously there's big gaps in it. There's big holes where we need to fill something in to be able to make this meaningful for us. It is a mystery ritual at its core. That is what we're talking about. However much fun, however silly and playful, however much laughing. And we're going to be talking at other points in this symposium about laughter-loving Aphrodite. Laughter is a big part of working with her, in my experience. They were still sacred things, unspoken things, mysteries that were being shared here. So that begs the question, what were the mysteries of Aphrodite? And there's no explicit record of what the ancients considered to be her mysteries. We don't know necessarily what they thought of as the mysteries of Aphrodite. We do know that they took their oaths of secrecy very seriously, and that is a lot of why it's not documented. It also might not be documented because these were considered great truths, as we're about to talk about, that everybody understood as being the mysteries of Aphrodite. They didn't need to be explicit in detailing those. It was what they meant that needed that exploration. So the nature of the mysteries in any mystery school, in any mystery tradition, is that mysteries are great truths, great universal truths of sort of human experience or experience within the natural world. They can be very difficult. They are naturally very difficult to put into words. And they often lack a punch on the page, right? So even if I wrote them out, which we're going to talk about some of them here in a little bit, it's really easy to say, yeah, I already get that. I already know that. Until you're experiencing it on that deep, sort of fundamental gnosis revealing level. It's part of why we don't share them verbally, because they don't mean as much verbally as they mean experientially. It's hard. They are a big aha moment in the moment that you're having them. Like a light bulb has gone off, like a door has opened within your mind or within your heart. And it's very challenging to express that in mundane, profane conversation. They're also, another part of the nature of mysteries is that they're very easy to miss or to misunderstand, because we think we're seeing everything. I use this analogy about Aphrodite all the time. She is the most naked goddess, right? She is one of the only Greek goddesses that is depicted nude. And I think that is her way of concealing by revealing. She's standing there in all of her glory for you to see, but you're so dazzled by it and think you already know something about that form that you just pass over it and don't look deeper. I think it's also possible that these mysteries have been staring us in the face for millennia, right? Since they were shared in this context of the ancient Aphrodisia rites, these mysteries haven't gone away. They didn't cease to exist. They're here, and we're looking at them, but maybe not seeing them, or seeing them, but not realizing for ourselves that what we're experiencing is one of the mysteries of Aphrodite. So here are some of the mysteries that I have shared within the Aphrodisia rituals that I've led over the years. This is just a starting off place, right? This is a springboard. So, pardon me. One of the mysteries that I've shared has to do with the judgment of Paris. Hera offers power, which is immediate. Athena offers fame and heroism, which is a version of immortality. But Aphrodite offers true love and beauty, which is both immediate and immortal. I'm pausing because I want it to sink. I want it to hit a little bit for you, but I understand that mysteries are hard to share on the page. Another one of the mysteries is that love conquers all. This Latin phrase, amor vincit omnia. Love wins in the judgment of Paris. Love wins. And I want to say it again because I want it to hit for you. Love wins always. Love wins everything. And we see this in the Judgment of Paris. We see this in the calendar. If you have not ever been pointed out to that April comes from a Latin epithet of Venus, of Aphrodite, Aprilis. April is Aphrodite's month, and it subdues the month of March, which is typically blustery and has very temperamental weather. And then April comes in and just soothes everything. And we see within the myths that Aphrodite soothes Aries, Venus soothes Mars. War is subdued ultimately by love, and only by love. Love and peace is more powerful than hate, than death, than anger. Love lives beyond all of those things. And love and peace are connected. And that she's also sometimes called a moire, a fate, because she can't be dissuaded. And when she decides that love will happen, even the fates can't change that. They can't argue with it. They can't cut it off. Love wins. Some of the other mysteries have included the idea of creation, creativity, and recreation that are all part of love and part of love making. I'm going to say that again. Creation is there in love. Creativity exists in love. And recreation, or joy, pleasure, exists in love and within the acts of love. These are all symbolized in her bath as well. So the Aphrodisia itself can be very much an honoring of the way that the rejuvenating process of sacred bathing is sacred birthing. Some of the other mysteries are about the star and the forge, the alchemical union of the celestial and the chthonic, of the upper world and the underworld, melding and uniting together. And we see this embodied in her marriage to Hephaestus. Also in her marriage to Hephaestus, we see the alchemical union of elements of water and fire, which is a big theme, and a big mystery that is there for exploring. We've also explored the union of sky and sea that is her, that she bridges, that she's that bridge between the sky and the sea. And we see that in the water birds that are associated with her as well, the geese and the swans and the ducks, that have flight, and are therefore, rulers of the sky in a sense, but are also make their way on the water and spend a lot of their lives on the water. And then finally, as far as what I've explored with other folks celebrating the Aphrodisia, is the relationship of love and war, and how this is expressed in her relationship with Ares, and that it's a fundamental draw that both she and he have. They're always looking for ways to be reunited, and that she herself embodies both love and war. She is a goddess of both love and peace, and also war and conflict. And we definitely see this in the earlier aspects of her worship. I mentioned that she was first worshipped in Cyprus, and the temple there was documented to have an image of her with weapons, specifically with a spear. And that should not be surprising for us, since the forerunners of her worship were Astarte and Ishtar and Inanna before her, and that those goddesses were all inextricably linked with both love and war. And it was only as her worship progressed in Greece that war was taken and made separate from her. But she's always finding her way back to him because they are one being. They are inherently linked. So those are some of the mysteries that I've explored. I would suggest that we also have some other sources for finding the mysteries as we're trying to uncover them, as we're trying to understand her. I have looked mainly to myth, And I don't look to myth rigidly, right? I don't take a fundamentalist approach in the sense that if it's written, then that's exactly literally what it means. For one thing, these stories weren't static to ancient audiences. They changed. They changed based on region, and they changed based on poetic differences in who was telling the story. They have become rigid and locked for us because some powerful magical thing happens when we write things down that sort of freezes them in thought. And so it's easy to look at the Homeric corpus of work and to say, oh, well, this is how the ancient Greeks thought of Aphrodite or Zeus or Achilles or, any of these figures that are within the myths. But that's not necessarily how they were. Different city-states had their own spin on who these figures were and what they did and what they brought and what their weaknesses were and what their strengths were. And then also different poets did, just as, and I'll give you this example, right? The story of the Trojan War, that love story between Helen and Paris, the love story that exists between Helen and Menelaus, the acts of war that happened throughout that event or series of events have been told and told and told in every generation, I think. I don't think there's ever been a time when we haven't been telling that story. But we have our own interpretations of what is the important focus in that story. The same thing can be said of the Arthurian legends. There's a new movie about King Arthur or about the Trojan War every few years, and it is not exactly the same story every time. So look to those myths and look for inspiration within them and be open to change. Be open to saying, what if this symbol or this act, this piece of the story actually means this? Or what if we got spin on here? Somebody spin doctored this story to make Aphrodite diminished or to make this figure within this myth small and not as powerful. What happens if we restore their power? How does the story work then? And that's where we find those mysteries. That's where I have found those mysteries. And then also looking to art, to the art that still exists from the ancient world and the art that has been based on these stories and these ancient artifacts. Because again, Aphrodite has never left us in terms of art. She's always been present. So how has she been speaking to the artists along the way? And then we can also look to the symbols that are there and ask them to reveal for us more of what they mean. The powerful thing about symbols is that they're very layered. They mean more than one thing. It is never just the apple means this. And in fact, just using that example, the apple, which is so central to Aphrodite's role at the beginnings of the Trojan War, and the apple that is very much a symbol for her in a lot of different contexts. It means so many different things. And you can think of, just off the top of your head, 4 or 5 different things that it means. For one, we have it linked to sort of Judeo-Christian mythology of the apple being the forbidden fruit. And so that's going to inform some of what we're seeing there. It becomes a forbidden fruit even in Aphrodite's stories because there's this fighting that's happening between Athena and Hera and Aphrodite over this apple that says Callisti on it for the fairest. You cut the apple in half, and you have this 5-pointed star. And, if you cut it across its midsection, you can see how the seeds make this 5-pointed star that is again a symbol that is inherently linked to Aphrodite's worship. Venus traces that pattern in the sky as it progresses through an Olympiad, which is a 4-year cycle. yeah, and that's just a handful of things that come right off the top of my head about the apple without going down and making this a different workshop than it was intended to be. So any of these symbols are rich and layered, and that's part of what makes them so powerful. I'll be editing that part out and taking a drink. So those are a few of the places that we might look for mysteries to explore or to share as part of the mystery ritual that is the Aphrodisia. But if we're creating an Aphrodisia ritual, which is what the topic of this workshop is about, then we need to think about some of the other ritual elements. And I personally, I've mentioned before, I really like to work with Aphrodite using elements of Hellenic ritual. I am not a Hellenic reconstructionist. I dabbled with that for a little while, and that was not the right path for me, but many of the elements of Hellenic ritual really spoke to me, especially in terms of working directly with this goddess. So I want to share what I have learned with you about this. And if you want a deeper exploration, you can look at Walter Burkert, the Greek religion book that I mentioned at the beginning. And you can also maybe check out Cult of Aphrodite, Rites and Festivals in Honor of the Golden One, which is my contribution to this work as well. So Greek ritual often involves something called a pump, or we might call it a procession, which is a little bit more Latin, Latinized version of the pump. We're familiar with a pump. We know a pump. In fact, in the United States, graduation ceremonies from secondary school and really almost all graduation ceremonies in an academic sense use a song called Pomp and Circumstance. And we see the participants engaging in a very ritualistic pomp or procession from the place of learning into this recognition of their culmination in that set of studies. We also have pomp or procession as part of wedding ceremonies. Contemporary, especially sort of Christian influenced wedding ceremonies tend to have the bridal party, particularly the bride and her attendants and her family, processing down the aisle. So a pomp or a procession is not unfamiliar to us, but it was very, very important within Greek ritual. So it's in fact one of the key features that sort of sets Greek ritual apart as being different, is the procession of the participants to the ritual site. So it was sort of a parade of ritual leaders, musicians, townspeople, and it marks the beginning of the festival, and it sets the tone for the rite to follow. That tone can be one of revelry, or it could be one of sobriety, or something else in between, right? Somewhere else on the scale. It's probably not going to be silent, though. In fact, that would be a very interesting tone, depending on what you were doing. But usually, music and dance were key elements as part of establishing the atmosphere of the pomp. In the rituals that I included in Cult of Aphrodite, I always suggested drumming, chanting, and singing as ways to sort of musically accompany that pump. But use whatever tools are available to you for that. You know, you might use panpipes and recorders or finger cymbals or ankle bells. Those are all methods that are pretty accessible even to non-musicians. If you don't see yourself or the people joining you in ritual don't see themselves as musicians, you can still create a lively feeling with all of those. And you could also use recorded music, both traditional recorded music and contemporary pieces. There's a lot of contemporary music that speaks to Aphrodisian themes. So that's always possible too. The physical pacing of the pomp does a lot to influence the tone of the entire ritual as well. So for instance, if you have a slower step, you may be establishing a more somber quality for instance, a funeral rite, or the Adonia, which is actually a funeral rite for Adonis. Alternatively, a bouncy or dancing step or at a slightly quick pace can accentuate the joy and playfulness of a joyous celebration. Most of the ancient processional dances of the Greeks seem to have been line dances that look a lot like what we think of as the grapevine step, where it's sort of one foot in front and then out and then behind and then out. Or sort of that, yeah, look it up. The grapevine step was there a lot. The procession is especially important in the Aphrodisia ritual too, I find, since according to that Cyprian version of the Aphrodisia, the group carries icons of Aphrodite and her daughter Peitho from the city of New Paphos to the ancient site of Old Paphos on the shore. So it's very much establishing that here versus there, and separating the worlds of the profane and the sacred, which is something that the pomp always does, but we really see it. I think it's really accentuated in the Aphrodisia ritual. A lot of times when I'm leading this, we don't necessarily have, I mean, we're not walking kilometers somewhere. We're not walking, a really great distance with our procession. We're not walking through an entire city or through an entire village, but maybe we are walking around, walking from somewhere that is not the ritual site within the park or within the festival grounds where we're doing this, to the place where the sacred acts are going to happen. We're establishing a space that is that sacred precinct and then walking to it very intentionally, which gives us that time to leave behind whatever we were doing before and to enter this space together now. And within that pomp, you're also going to have bearers of sacred objects. Like we discussed in the illustration, this idea of carrying water, carrying fire, carrying salt, carrying barley, carrying a basket. Somebody's going to be carrying the icon of Aphrodite. Somebody else is going to be carrying the icon of Peitho, if you're including Peitho in this. And I recommend including Peitho. So each of those people is acting as a sacred functionary, and maybe they're chosen for reasons that make sense to you. Maybe it's based on a good name, a bona nomina, something that's auspicious for what they're carrying, or maybe based on something that they're wearing. They didn't know that they might get chosen for that, but they came wearing fiery, flamey red, and now they're the torchbearer, for instance. We've got music and musicians within the pomp. So I love this image. If you don't have trained musicians within the group that's gathered, you can always play recorded music. But I kind of like to encourage people to make some music, even if it's just a simple drum beat. The jingling of a tambourine, which we can see here in this image, and we see that they're sort of dancing because they're on their toes. Or one of the two musicians here is playing the double flute. I think it's called a dialis. So you could use a recorder, the sort of the instrument in the US that all fourth graders, I think, are forced to learn how to play, at least a little bit. Or you could create a chant for your procession, or use a song that you've written or that you've adapted. I'm actually a really big fan of the adapted song. One of my favorite Aphrodisia songs is an adaptation of Down in the River to Pray, which that song, Down in the River to Pray, is a gospel song of African American origins, that's well known in many American Christian churches. I don't know how well known it is outside of the United States, but when we do it in the US, people always know this song. I haven't dug really deeply on the subject of this song's history, but I really wouldn't be surprised to learn that the song has potential roots in West African religious practice, particularly in something like the worship of Oshun. I can see the connection there, or how there could be a connection there. Oshun was the Orisha of rivers and gold and honey and sexuality. And if that's true, then I personally give a really hearty thanks and heartfelt thanks to Oshun for guiding me in rewriting the lyrics that I use, which might as fully sing of Oshun's mysteries as they do of Aphrodite's. So in the version that I use, and I'm not going to sing it necessarily right now, but the way the lyrics go is, as I went down in the river to pray, setting about that good old way, and she who wears the starry crown, oh love, show us the way. Oh lovers, let's go down. Let's go down, come on down. Oh lovers, let's go down in the river to pray. And I'll add that since I live in the Midwestern United States, I am not close to an ocean. I am not close to a sea. Rivers are my connection to Aphrodite on a daily basis. And when I've done this one, typically we are taking the icons of Aphrodite and Peitho to a nearby creek or small river, or a big river. If we happen to be, working close to the Ohio River, for instance, we'll stand on the shores of the river to do this work. And that has historical precedence. In more inland places in Greece where Aphrodite had a large following, if they were more inland, they were using rivers and springs as their connection to Aphrodite, that she wasn't just the goddess of the ocean, she was the goddess of the water. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the idea of sacred space. I mentioned the sacred precinct. And so I've titled this slide Quarters and Sacred Space because within contemporary magical, mystical, pagan, polytheistic practice, we see a circle being cast and quarters being called, and that's pretty standard fare. Those are familiar concepts to almost all of us. But it was different in Hellenic ritual. So in Hellenic ritual and in Hellenic religion, I should say, the sacred space is usually referred to with the term temenos, Temenos. And that was the temple or the grove, the sacred precinct, in which members of the community would come together to celebrate and honor the rites that were for each of the gods. And they had their own sacred spaces. So you were going to a different place for different rituals. Each temenos was sacred to a specific deity, and each was maintained by the priesthood or by the community. Your temenos is likely to be a site that's used for other activities as well, right? Like, so here in our contemporary world, we don't usually, aside from churches and most of us are not necessarily worshiping Aphrodite within a church building. We're going to be using other places that are sacred, that we see as sacred to Aphrodite, but those spaces may be getting used by other people that don't see them as sacred, or they may be getting used by us for non-sacred activities, for profane things. So for instance, our living room or a converted garage may very well be that temple space. And in that sense, they can house the goddess for an evening. But in the morning, it's going to go back to being the place where you watch television, where you're talking to your friends, where you're playing with your children or your pets, where you're reading books, where you're arguing with your spouse about something, maybe. Um, it becomes a mundane, profane kind of space again. So if you are lucky enough to have a dedicated space, then you can take the Greek attitude about its inherent sanctity, that you don't have to do anything to prepare that space because it is prepared. It is naturally already sacred and sanctified. And you, oh human, don't have to intervene. It wouldn't require fresh cleansing before every ritual. Maybe you would cleanse it with a special ceremony once a year. Maybe your Aphrodisia ritual is that ceremony where you're washing the icon and you're cleansing the space. But you don't necessarily have to do that every time you approach the space. However, if that is not your situation, then you're probably going to be doing a little bit of cleansing and creating of that sacred space, or just centering with it, taking a moment to attune to it, doing something to set it aside. And it's also worth noting that ancient Greek religious rituals didn't include the four quarters or the magic circle that are present in most modern rituals today. Those concepts came out of the Hermetic magical tradition, which does have some of its roots in Greek thinking. But there are other roots as well to that Hermetic magical tradition. And all of those roots were based on magical principles that rarely, if ever, touched the lives of sort of your common pious Hellene. Your average person in the Hellenic world did not involve themselves with magic. It wasn't illegal, but it was not done by most people. So that circle and quarters are a different thing. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about cleanliness and or cleansing. Cleansing and cleanliness were a big deal in the Aphrodisia. It's one of the central purposes of the entire festival, is this idea of cleansing and cleaning, connecting with ideas of cleansing and cleaning the statues, bathing them, redressing them. But we're going to talk a little bit first about cleansing the space. So if, like most of us, you have to convert your living room, your bedroom or backyard, or for your ritual use, then you may want to do something to clear it out of those profane energies. And that might simply mean just sending away the common everyday energies in order to engage with the sacred. So the method that I use to do that is pretty simple. We're going to sprinkle that lustral water, that kernips, over the altar and the area that we're using in the ritual. Lustral water, as I mentioned in our conversation on lustration, is pure water. It can be from a natural flowing source like a spring or a river. You can also use bottled spring water, and you can purify tap water with sea salt and a flaming branch, or lit incense stick to create that kernips, that lustral water. And so it's just sprinkling it over the space. And then we have to think about personal cleansing within this too. So personal cleanliness was really of the utmost importance to each and every participant of ancient Greek rites. You would not consider entering the temple without having bathed and dressed in clean clothing before you even arrived there. And then furthermore, there's going to be either outside of the temple, there's going to be a font in which you would prepare yourself then with sacred water before entering the temple, or a ritual participant known as the hydrophoros, or the water bearer, would have poured water over the hands of each person, rinsing the hands as they entered the temenos. And then maybe the person would put that water on their face, or I often feel moved in a more contemporary context to not just have the water on my hands, but to put it on my face, to put it on my heart, and then on my belly. Um, that is also an act of lustration. That is a lustral ritual or a lustral rite. And really, if you think about it, most pagan and like neo-pagan Wiccan traditions at one time instructed their initiates to take a ritual bath in order to prepare for ritual. I'm not sure that that's always the common practice today. I don't know that everybody's doing that, but it used to be, if you look back at some of the older books on the subject, you were always told to do that. And that was definitely what was happening within coven work. So I think that there's a lot of shortcuts that might be happening today, but I would highly recommend that if you're going to be doing this sort of ritual, that you still engage in that bathing or showering first, coming clean, wearing clean clothing. It doesn't have to be special set aside clothing, but it should be clean clothing. And then engaging in the sprinkling. And then cleaning and cleansing, again, being so important, central to this particular Aphrodisia ritual, you're going to be engaging in washing the statues. Most Aphrodisia rituals are reenacting Aphrodite's bath by way of bathing her statue and that of her daughter, Peitho, as part of the central actions of the ritual. And her bath is one of those multi-layered symbols, as all good symbols are, that speaks of birth, rebirth, cleansing, creation, rejuvenation, self-care, and sensuality. So one of my lectures at a future Aphrodite Summit will undoubtedly be just about the power of this symbol, the power of Aphrodite's bath. For now, though, we're going to let it suffice to say that we want to bathe the icons and also bathe ourselves. If you're feeling very frisky, then the celebrants, who should already be clean before the ritual, can also cleanse and bathe themselves in the sacred waters after the icons have been bathed. Aphrodite goes first, and then Peitho, and then everybody else can get into those same waters, or to use the waters that have been used. Like if you've got them in a bowl or a tub of some kind and that you're using that to wash the statues, those would then be really holy waters to wash yourself in as well. That's a good ritual. So let's talk a little bit about participation, because each person in a Hellenic ritual, and in the Aphrodisia in particular, should be an active participant in the ritual. They are not just standing there and witnessing. They are not having something done in front of them. It is being done with them. They are doing it. So one way that many Greek ritual groups accomplish this is by having each participant there throw a handful of barley onto the altar. Another way to do that, and that helps with the cleansing process, and also with the adding sort of your intention and your presence. I'm here. Another way that you can include everybody is to ask everyone to sing. If there's a song that you're singing or a chant that you're chanting, or to play an instrument during the procession, also helps involve everybody. And then in the Aphrodisia specifically, you can ask that everyone take a hand in washing the statues. Like literally everybody's hands get wet. Everybody helps. Everybody washes Aphrodite. Everybody washes Peitho. Libation is a fun aspect, I feel like, of Greek ritual as well. And so we see here a crotcher that depicts a crotcher. It's almost this mise en infinity, like this infinite view, like on the crotcher that's there, on this urn or vase that's there. There should be another vase that's painted showing a priestess pouring water in. Um, Offering food and drink to deities and ancestors is actually a really common occurrence within almost all neo-pagan circles. the need to do so is obvious and its application is abundant for most neo-pagans. The cakes and ale ceremony, or cakes and wine, the red meal, the huzel that accompanies many pagan or Wiccan rites, is a really well-known libation. That's an example of a really well-known libation. The Greeks did libation a little bit differently than what we often see contemporarily. And they had a couple of different needs and practices for libation. So nearly all of the rituals that I've written about in Cult of Aphrodite are going to incorporate the spondi or sponde. And the spondi is a controlled pour to the ground or into a container like we're seeing here. So the spondi is a shared drink in which the person doing the pouring takes a drink and of the liquid, and then they pour other parts of the liquid either onto the ground or onto a sacred container. And in that way, they're sharing a drink with the gods. But there's also a few instances in which the complete, utter giving over to the gods is needed, and it's usually a very passionate kind of libation, and it's called the Koe, which is spelled Khoe, if you're trying to look that up. So the Koe involves spilling or dumping or smashing a container of liquid so that that offering is fully given and none remains inside the container. A few years ago, probably about 10 years ago now, I remember seeing a video that I cannot find anymore on YouTube, but it was of a contemporary Hellenic polytheistic group. So these were Greek people in Greece performing ancient Greek ritual, and they had a large jug of wine that they then threw against the rocks, shattering the jug and offering the liquid to, and I think it was a ritual of Dionysus. It was a festival of Dionysus that they were honoring at that time. But that would be an example of, that's all for him, we don't get any of it. And we see a similar concept within Holocaust or holy burnt offerings to the gods. Normally the meat sacrifices that we see, where they're sacrificing a bull to Poseidon on the seashore, which Odysseus did not do when he was supposed to. That's a shared meal. The gods get parts of it, those parts get burned, and then the humans cook and eat the other parts. So it wasn't just, a spilling of lifeblood and sort of a destroying of that. It was a communal feast, and that communion happened between the gods and the people there. So a lot of times when we see those Koe offerings, they're happening within an Koe jug, which is the name of the type of jug. And it's offered either to ancestors or to the gods of the underworld. That's what's meant by chthonic, right? And that the way that we get things to the chthonic deities is by putting them in the ground. And you may not want to pour either type of this libation on the floor of your home. If you're doing this ritual in your living room, you probably aren't pouring it straight to the ground into your carpet. And you might even have some thoughtful objections to libating alcohol to the ground outside. I've known several people who do not feel like that is an appropriate offering, to pour alcohol, liquor onto the ground where they live. So there are a couple of options for modifying the spondi, and one is shown here in this vase image, actually. So you can pour it into a libation bowl. And then another option would be the internal libation of your drinking it on behalf of the gods. So you can sit with those and see how they feel and play with them maybe and see what works better in your situation. I think some people feel like that internal libation sounds like cheating, but for others it makes a lot of sense. So just sort of play with it and figure out what you like, what resonates. Wine is always it is always appropriate. It is an appropriate offering at the Aphrodisia. And so is spring water. But other libations might also make sense to you, especially if you do not consume alcohol, but you want something different than pure water. So you might use things like apple juice or honey, for example, or if the alcohol is not the problematic part for you, you might even use a honeyed wine or mead as the libation that you're offering. You could also make an infused water, a water that has been infused with apple or rosemary or other sacred herbs and fruits, to sort of bring Aphrodite's presence into your being in a different way. Hellenic ritual often has, and especially for the mysteries, a call for silence. So this is a common component in Greek ritual, and we show here a statue of Harpocrates in the classic be quiet or don't say anything about this gesture with the finger over the lips. This usually happens at the beginning of the ritual or somewhere near the beginning of the ritual before the actual work of the ritual is happening. And it's based on the idea that an inauspicious utterance, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time or off-topic chatter can be damaging for the many purposes of the rite. And the ancients understood this. It's also a call to remain silent about the mystery that's being revealed in the ritual. So many mystery schools hold to the idea that gnosis was received from the gods and should never be uttered in profane spaces and never, ever uttered to the uninitiated. Even if you're going to talk about it to somebody else that was there with you in that rite, and you know that they're initiated into those mysteries, you still don't talk about it over coffee at Starbucks. And you would take care whenever you're talking about it to make sure that uninitiated people are not within earshot. Since the Aphrodite, or since the Aphrodisia is a mystery ritual, at least the Cyprian version we know is a mystery ritual, then a call for silence seems especially appropriate. And this call might be made just before the priestess shares the mysteries with the group. This vase shows Hestia. This is Hestia who's sitting here. Hestia's name means hearth. And Hestia was a very important goddess, so important that she was honored in every temple, in every home, in every ritual, like in every festival to the gods. So whether or not you're a practicing Hellenic pagan, you may want to consider including her because of that special role that she's given within ancient Greek culture. So she's the keeper of the hearth flame and the temple flame. And like I said, she's honored in every home. And usually we see a line like Hestia, Hestia, first and last, spoken at a time maybe when her flame is being honored or a candle is being lit to her. And then again, as that candle is respectfully put out at the end of the ritual. And there's usually a sacrifice or a feast, and I touched on this earlier, right? So feasting is really an essential part of Greek ritual. The word festival actually derives from the word feast, and all of the civic rituals of the Greeks included the sacrifice of an animal whose then entrails would be burned as part of an offering to the gods, sometimes red, depending on that they'd be red first and then burned. And then the meat would be roasted for the community to feast upon. We have a little bit of a debate about the propriety of live sacrifice on Aphrodite's altars, though. So Empedocles tells us that Aphrodite is repulsed by bloodshed and that she does not tolerate it in her rituals. And of course, live sacrifice isn't really a common practice in neo-Hellenic rites or neo-pagan rites. Most people are not, they're not bringing an animal in, blessing it, killing it, preparing it for eating, and then roasting it and sharing that. That's just not something that we commonly do. Although interestingly, we like pig roasts are definitely a thing in different places in the US, and I would assume maybe different places in Europe that you could have a party that involved that. And especially if you tend to live in a more rural area, that wouldn't be considered wildly inappropriate, but you bring religion into it and then it becomes scary for folks around you. So it's not, that part really doesn't offer any kind of moral dilemma for most neo-Hellenic folks or neo-pagans or Aphrodisians. We don't really have this debate of, am I going to kill a dove on Aphrodite's altar or not? Because the answer is a resounding no, we're not doing that. But we do have to consider then whether including meat is appropriate to our celebration of the Aphrodisia or of other Aphrodite rituals. If she is opposed to that bloodshed, does she want us not even consuming meat as part of her feast? My personal view is that vegetarianism wasn't necessarily common practice among the ancient Hellenes. It was a practice, though. The Orphics practiced vegetarianism. It just wasn't the norm. Most people weren't vegetarian. So it's likely that an animal still would have been slaughtered for the communal feasts for Aphrodite. And for this reason, I personally can't imagine that carnivorous dishes at a contemporary feast would be considered inappropriate for an Aphrodisian celebration. But I think that that's up to you and your community to decide for yourselves as well. One exception to that statement could be made in regards to pork. I mentioned the pig roast, and the pig roast might be the thing that you should not ever do for Aphrodite. So we're told that Aphrodite finds pork to be offensive and unclean, owing to the role that the boar played in the death of Adonis, who was beloved of Aphrodite. So we shouldn't offer it to her at feasts. This was in a lot of ancient Greece. This was the common view. She hates pigs. Don't sacrifice pigs to her. But that's according to most sources. And in some locales, the people felt that Aphrodite hated the pigs so much that she delighted in them being killed on her behalf. So, and in fact, there's a festival called the Hysteria, which is about the slaughtering of pigs for Aphrodite. So whichever side of that debate that you fall on, I just suggest that you know why you're choosing your side of that debate and that you stay consistent with your practice. And of course, vegetarians, vegans, veganism are much more common today. So if you don't personally eat meat or animal products, there's absolutely no reason to feel compelled to include them within your ritual feasts for Aphrodite. I would think personally that the wholeness, the freshness, the wholesomeness of the foods, along with maybe the sensuality of the ingredients or the textures and the experience of that eating, and the way it nourishes your body would be a lot more important to what you're choosing to include in your feast. Okay, so that's the end of sort of some of the things to consider and what you might include in your Aphrodisia ritual. So now let's talk about a couple of adaptations or additions that you might also consider as you're creating your own. So if you're looking for ways to create an aphrodisia that fits more neatly into a Wiccan or neo-pagan group, without having to relearn what ritual looks like, then there are some easy and maybe even probably pretty obvious ways that you can adapt what we've just discussed. Of course, I've already said that I like to say the obvious things because they're not always obvious to everybody. What's obvious to me may not be obvious to you. So, and these kind of just go along here together, right? So the procession could be a casting of the circle, could be a treading of the mill if you use that terminology for walking, circumambulation, walking in a circle around the space. It could be a circle dance that you perform together. So there are ways to include that procession in things that you're already doing and just sort of bring your awareness to it. The temenos itself might be you casting that circle and calling the quarters to establish that sacred space. And then the feast might not be a big spread with lots of food that the entire group is, sitting down to eat together. It may be something as simple as the cakes and ale or the cakes and wine, the Eucharist that you are sharing together. So those are some of those thoughts. And with that, really, oh, no, hold on. We got more. We do have more. The last thing that we can think about is ways that we might adapt or have alternatives for that measure of salt and the phallus cake that I talked about way back at the beginning. Early in the lecture, I gave you ideas for the mysteries and how to uncover others. And then I also had talked about the fact that it was the bathing of the statues, the sharing of the mysteries, and then that each participant got a measure of salt and a phallus cake. So I thought I'd share some ideas for other ways that you might give a measure of salt and a phallus to the initiates that are part of your ritual. So on the left side are all of the salty things, and on the right side are all of the phallic things that you might include. So, and some of these I've done, and some of these are just ideas that I've had that I would like to do. So you might give out sea salt or bath salts that you've created in organza bags or in some other way, a container, maybe a sealed box that they can carry them in, or a bottle of some kind. But that could be your measure of salt. You could give them a chunk of sea salt on the tongue, so that they're tasting that salt and really incorporating it into their own embodied experience. Blended blended bath salts in a container, or a blended salt scrub that you give them in a container where everybody's getting the same sort of measurement of that salt. You could do a chunk of pink salt on a rope or a string. You can actually find those online, but you could also make them by getting these sort of chunks of pink salt and then just drilling a hole through them and stringing them. You could give them salt licks, like, the little pucks that you give to certain animals so that they're getting enough salt in their diet. You could give everybody a salt lick. If you're being really fancy, or if it's a very small group, because this next one is expensive, you could give everybody a pink salt lamp, like a Himalayan pink salt lamp. You could also do colored salt jars, where there's layers of different colors of salt. You'd have to prepare that in advance by, maybe adding food dye to the salt and letting that dry, and then layering it like sand art in a jar where people can see then those layers that are happening. Or you could even think about doing salt sculptures. And if you've never heard of salt sculptures, go look them up as soon as we're done here. This is our last slide. So go and check out what salt sculptures look like. You could create something like that. It would be a very labor-intensive process, but you could do that. So then let's talk about the phallus cake. So it could be phallic cakes that you make using like a cupcake or a muffin recipe and baking them in penis-shaped pans. You can find these at specialty stores that specialize in adult products, and they have them online. I've done this one. It's a lot of fun. You could also do phallic cookies where you use a penis-shaped cookie cutter to make phallic cookies. They sell these wonderful silicone ice cube trays that make little bitty ice phalluses. So you could do phallic ice cubes. And I will tell you, this is one that I have done. And the year that I decided to do the ice penises was so hot when we were doing the Aphrodisia ritual. And everybody ended up like really, there was some nibbling and sucking on the little ice phalluses, but also just like really rubbing them on ourselves and getting getting that enjoyment out of them. There's a lot of laughter in this part of the in this part of the ritual. So hail Aphrodite Philomedes, lover of genitals and laughter. You could do phallic candies. There's hard candies and gummies and chocolates, that all of which you can get in these penis shapes. They sell them usually for things like, you know, bachelorette parties kind of thing. And I listed, oh, I thought I listed phallic candies twice, but I didn't. The next one is candles, because you can buy penis-shaped candles. These are actually used in magical practices in certain traditions, so they're pretty easy to come by. You can also do, there are kits available, and Clone Willy and Clone Boy are two examples of these kits that are available, whereby you can take a mold of an actual penis of a person who is a participant, or maybe you have multiple penis volunteers to mold, to make a mold, and then you use silicone basically to make them. So you could have an array of different phalluses that are being offered from phallically endowed people within the group. You know, penis bearing people can make their thing. There's also phallic shaped crystals. So I've seen, and actually not in regards to an Aphrodisian ritual, but in regards to a Beltane ritual one year, the high priestess of the coven that I was a part of gave us all a small crystal penis. They were about 1.5 inches long, maybe just an inch. They were pretty little, tucked neatly into a pouch, but those are findable. So you could always give those out. And there are even phallic novelty toys and gifts, like stress relief squishes, little squishy penises, little phallic dolls. You could make little phallic dolls to give to people as well. So those are some ideas. And again, I feel like people, myself especially, I'm talking to myself right now. You guys are not here with me yet. So just sitting here talking about penis squishies, and it just brings a smile to your face, which is a very Aphrodisian feeling. I would love to hear other ideas that you guys have about the mysteries, about the measure of salt and the phallus, about how to incorporate these bits of Hellenic ritual into your Aphrodisia, about what the bathing of the statues might look like, about what kind of icons you're using for Aphrodite and for Peitho, or if you're including Peitho, and if you're not including Peitho, are you including somebody else, or is it just Aphrodite? So again, I'm going to encourage you to go into the Discord server and let's have a bit of a conversation about some of these things. And I absolutely cannot wait to hear about the Aphrodisias that you are leading or thinking about leading where you are. Thank you, beloveds. I'll see you in the next one.